polling in New Jersey and in the nation. What's the role of our very successful polling institute here on the Jersey Shore? Next on Community Connections. Welcome to Community Connections. I'm Don Swanson, a long-term member of the Cable Commission and professor of communication at Monmouth University. And we're delighted this evening to have a little bit of time from our distinguished polling director at Monmouth University, Patrick Murray. Welcome, Patrick.
My pleasure to be here, Don.
I think we should begin by talking a little bit about the Polling Institute. I know this is an exciting topic for me because I remember a decade ago when we were in the process of hiring you and hoping that things would go well with the new Polling Institute, and I think they certainly have. Tell us a little bit about the mission of the Polling Center.
Well, thanks. I wanted to, when I came here and talking to you and others at the university, wanted to create a polling institute that was a cut above others because we wanted to do things that were academically sound, but also really spoke to the real needs of people out on the street. And I think you'll see, as you look through our wealth of data that we've collected over the past 9 years, is that we ask questions in the way that people on the street talk about them. That we talk about issues that are really important to people, not the issues that political scientists or politicians say are important, but the issues that people say are important. And the reason why we do that is I see the Polling Institute and entities like us as having a role in the political process. And that role is to call attention to the real needs of people and to hold our political leaders accountable for answering those needs. Now, that doesn't mean that political leaders should be led by polls. They should be led by whatever the popular opinion is. No, it means we're going to put this on the table. This is what people think. You have to respond to this. Are you doing the right thing? Are you not doing the right thing? If people have the wrong impression, you have to explain why. But it's a way to hold our political leaders accountable, to make the process more representative of what people think.
So you've covered a lot of important things there, I think, about the language of polling and the difficult process of putting them together, how a pollster sees their role, and how it's really consumed by the news media, by the public, by the political parties. Let's try to talk about a lot of those things, but before we do, let's talk a little bit more about the Monmouth University poll, because I know I'm very proud of that poll, and I think a lot of people may not be aware of some of the kudos you've received lately. If I'm not mistaken, out of how many polling organizations are there in the country, major ones?
About 350 working today, yeah.
About 350 working today, and they get ranked by an organization?
538.com.
Okay, and they rank them A, B, and so forth down the line, right? And Monmouth University is ranked?
We have a ranking of A. We are one of only 22 organizations in the country that received a ranking of A for the accuracy of our election polling.
Okay, that's great. One of the top 22 in election polling. That's terrific.
It's something we do take pride in. I do try to get things right, and we could talk about exactly how we do it, and it's different than others. But I also want to point out, too, is that all those other things that I said before are really important to us. And I think that's what makes us different. Yes, we get the elections right, but we also do the things that matter to people. For example, no other polling organization in the country has done more work around Superstorm Sandy recovery than we have here at Monmouth University. And that's because we made a commitment as soon as it happened. So we're in the center of this thing. How can we contribute to the effort? And it's not just simply by asking people what do they think about the recovery effort or the governor's efforts about recovery. Do they approve or disapprove? Those questions are important, but the real questions that we've been asking are going down door to people who are most affected by this storm and finding out how have they been able to negotiate this system. The stuff that we've done with the victims of Sandy has, in fact, it's being presented, some of the information is now being presented to both the state government and federal government by those on the ground saying, here is documentation of some of the problems that we're having that need to be fixed. And so those are the things that at the end of the day, I'm even more proud of than what I feel our team, and I have a great team here at Monmouth University. Tim Tracy and Tina Johnson are the core to our team, and I need to mention them as well. We do great stuff with the election polling, sure, and if that helps us to get even more recognition for the important work that we're doing to try to help people here in New Jersey and across the country, the better for it.
Right. Again, that sounds exciting to me, because I think when you say to document the conclusions that some people may draw if they pay attention to the detail is important. I picked up the paper here to take a look at, because I printed out a list of polls that you've done in the last several years that is on your website and easily accessible. And I see a lot of recent polls about Sandy aid and about the recovery efforts, so that true information is available there, not just the kind of emotional blither that we may get from talk radio and some other sources.
This is real data that's being used to help advocates for victims to go back and lobby for changes to the aid process. We did something that was totally out of the box that people weren't expecting, which was we also documented issues with mental health, post-traumatic stress disorder, which we know is an issue, but nobody was really documenting it. And we were the only ones who had some documentation, which is helping the mental health community throughout the area be able to focus on where those key issues are at play and continue to be at play more than 2 years now after that storm.
Okay. Well, so those are the ongoing issues.
Oh, and by the way, and if you want to find out more information about the polling, monmouth.edu/polling.
Monmouth.edu/.
Yeah, you'll get all our information there.
Yeah, that's easy to remember.
Yeah.
As I recall also, when we first established the Polling Institute, a key element was for you to focus on the quality of life in New Jersey and the Jersey Shore in particular. Is that correct?
Right. And what we did is back in 2010, we mounted a very large-scale statewide survey and nearly 3,000 respondents in it. We asked more than 100 questions about all aspects of the quality of life of New Jersey, and put out a glossy report about, where do we stand. We had some questions going back from other polling organizations more than 30 years. So we had these huge trend lines, and we identified 5 key questions that we asked that really underscored what the quality of life of New Jersey was from the point of view of perceptions of people. And perceptions are really important here. Because we hear about the jobless rate and we hear about the housing market. But what do people really think about quality of life in New Jersey is more important to whether they stay or go than some of these hard statistics.
Polls, right? Yeah.
And what we found is that these 5 questions, if we ask them, built an index, and we can track that index, which we've been doing about every quarter since 2010. It's much like the Consumer Confidence Index that's been used to kind of highlight how people feel about the direction of the economy, and that helps inform economic leaders and the business community about what's going to go on in that area, because of whether people feel confident enough. The jobless rate and other things are not as important as whether people feel comfortable enough that they can start spending. Our quality of life measure here in New Jersey, our index, it tells leaders whether people feel that it's time for them to go or not, and whether they need to do something about that.
I guess, as we say in persuasion theory, perception is reality.
Yeah, and that's exactly, as a pollster, that's something that we have to come to understand, and it cuts both ways. One is, as a pollster, I have to remember that I am measuring perception in many cases. There are things that we go out there when we do needs assessment and program evaluations, which we actually do for state governments and local governments and nonprofit organizations that are serving certain communities, which is one of the services that we provide here at Monmouth, and I think makes us a little different, is to take our expertise and help these agencies more efficiently provide programs that are directed towards the people that need them. But we also know that we're measuring perceptions, and perceptions are really important. They tell us whether the public feels that people are doing the right thing. Even if those in power think they're doing the right thing, it's really the perception that drives what's going on. And so, for example, about half of New Jersey wants to leave the state, and why is it? Well, it's because of property taxes. You've got to do something about property taxes, and if our leaders keep ignoring that and say, oh, we're fixing this or we're fixing that, but we're not fixing the main thing that are driving people out, then you're going to miss something there.
Okay. You said there were something like 5 key questions or trend lines, if I was listening carefully.
Yeah, we asked the 5 key questions are basically like
yeah.
an overview of the state, and then we focus on neighborhoods, environmental quality, the quality of schools, crime. These are the key areas that we found when we did, this is great, at a university, you could take 100 questions and you put them into a computer and you do all these reliability tests and all sorts of things, and it kept coming up that these 5 questions were the core questions that really were driving perceptions, or I should say measuring perceptions of quality of life.
Right. Any quick conclusions that citizens in New Jersey should be aware of?
I think that the thing is that we keep trying. We keep trying to get their voice out there, and we keep hammering away. As I said, we've done more polling on Sandy than anybody else. I personally, as a pollster, have asked more questions about property taxes than any pollster who has ever lived on the planet has asked about property taxes, just because I know how important that issue is.
Okay. Any other lifestyle issues or questions that you've asked over the last 9 years that might really surprise people?
Well, I don't know whether they surprise people, but it's funny some of the things that hit. In fact, we did a poll back this past fall, and I realized that we were going to do the interviewing right before Bruce Springsteen's 65th birthday. And I said, you know what, let's throw some questions on about how people feel about the boss here in New Jersey. And sure enough, I think 4% had an unfavorable opinion of Bruce Springsteen.
4%?
Just 4%. I don't know who those 4% are, but I guess Bon Jovi fans probably. But what was interesting about that, and we asked a couple of other questions which were fun, like, do you think it's kind of cool or kind of embarrassing that Chris Christie is such a big fan of Bruce Springsteen? These polls, they ended up getting picked up by all the national networks, this poll question, because it is a fun, and it tells us a little bit about who we are.
Yeah, it's fun. It also says to me, as somebody who's watched for 40 plus years from an academic level news, something has changed in news in my mind, that they're much more excited about the fluff than the serious issues.
Well, they do cover the polls, and that's something that we can talk about. I mean, the poll, a lot of news is poll driven. A lot of the world is numbers driven, but the poll driven, and there's some problems with that as well. But we try to do the best job that we can possibly do here at Monmouth, and we're not just doing, you've noticed that we're not just doing statewide polling, we're also branching out nationally too.
Right.
I think the stuff that we're doing is good enough that we need to take our perspective. I think it's a different perspective than what other pollsters are doing, and take it nationally as well.
I noticed that in October you did a lot of polling of important state races, U.S. Senate races in various places.
Yeah. We, for example, in Georgia, we were the only one who showed how far ahead the Republicans were,
really?
both for the Senate and for the governorship. In fact, I got calls from Democrats in Georgia saying my numbers were off, my likely voter models were off, and turned out not to be the case at all. And certainly here in New Jersey, we hit the nail on the head again, both in key congressional races around the state as well as the state Senate race, or the U.S. Senate race here in New Jersey. These are important things that help us and help inform us about why people vote and how they don't. And in fact, we're doing some follow-up work on that to look at what happened to be a record low turnout as a way to kind of better understand what was going on here in this. It turned out to be a really bizarre election because of how low the turnout was across the country.
Yeah, it really is in many ways, and I think we're going to take a break here in a minute, but I think in the second half we ought to talk a little bit about some of that, because one of the fascinating things that I'm going to ask you then is, how do you decide who to ask these questions of? How in the world does a good pollster like you, who is really research-based, determine who to ask the questions of, and how do you get at that? So we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Community Connections. I'm Don Swanson, a member of the Long Branch Cable Television Commission. And we're delighted to be talking with Patrick Murray, director of the Monmouth University poll. Patrick, I think that people who've been listening to you probably recognize that you're devoted to the quality of research. In fact, you teach research methods. I know our graduate students have said it's one of the most challenging courses that they've ever taken, and that you're devoted to accuracy. And we were just talking about the fact that your polls have been very accurate. I think other people recognize that as well. Noted that recently you're the only person in Monmouth County who has been on the Politicker NJ power list of the 100 unelected most influential people in New Jersey. You were the only one from Monmouth County listed.
Yes, that's what I've been told.
That's a mouthful. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's what I've been told. Yeah, I've been on the list for the last 4 years, 4 or 5 years. And I think the key there, and I think that's why Monmouth's brand in terms of our polling has become more powerful and people pay more attention to us in the halls of power, is because we have a record for accuracy, but also we have a record for being true to what the voice of the people are and really understanding this. I mean, I don't spend my time in the ivory tower. I get out around the state a lot. I spend time in Trenton. I spend time, rubbing shoulders with politicos of all stripes, so I can better understand what drives them. So that when we come back to the classroom, and this is what's really important, come back to the classroom, can give students a common sense understanding of what real politic is, and how it operates. And when I write questions, then I understand how the politicians are talking about, and I tell people, this is how I write questions. I listen to talk radio, and I hang out in diners and eavesdrop on conversations, because that's the last place, that's the last bastion of talking about politics, I think, in this country, and particularly in this state. And it gives me an idea of how these conversations are taking place, both of those in power and those who are supposed to be served by those in power. And we put all those together, and I think it comes to that. That's why we stand apart.
And as someone who really appreciates and teaches language, I think I understand that what you're saying is the way you phrase the question is terribly important.
Yeah.
Because if I were a very partisan pollster, I could phrase questions to get the kind of response I wanted, right?
Right. I mean, there's that. Let's talk about just one basic thing, which is nonpartisan, which is when go back 5 years when Governor Christie came into office and he proposed his first budget. Most pollsters were asking, do you approve or disapprove, or do you agree or disagree with this budget? And I'm listening to conversations on the street, really listening to them, and people are saying, I don't like the cuts that the governor is making, but I can live with it because he's doing something. I thought, that's an interesting perspective, because it's neither approve or disapprove. It's somewhere in the middle. And in fact, when we asked the question in the Monmouth University poll, the question was, are you satisfied with the budget? Are you not particularly satisfied, but you can live with it? Or are you dissatisfied with it? That was because that better reflected the way people were talking about it. So that was part of what we do. But then the other part is, there are a lot of bad polls out there, and there are a lot of polls that are designed to form opinion rather than measure it. And so just recently in New Jersey, there were a couple polls out. There was one poll particularly out on red light cameras. And in fact, I pulled it out. And it was done by a well-known political strategy pollster. And it was done for one of the red light camera companies. So the questions were asked about, have you seen or heard anything about safety cameras being used at dangerous intersections for the enforcement and monitoring of traffic safety laws? And then when they asked people if you approve or disapprove of them, lo and behold, they got 76% who approved. Now, I did a poll.
They just planted the concept of safety.
Yeah, it's safety, dangerous, they're monitoring. And I asked, when I did a poll on red light cameras, I asked the question of, do you approve or disapprove of using cameras at intersections to issue tickets for red lights, for going through red lights, which is basically what they do. No judgment one way or the other. And lo and behold, I got about half of that, the number that this other poll got, who were in support of that, who approved of that. And yes, and you have to be aware of this. The press are sort of good at this, but I think have gotten a little lazy. of trying to sort through this, because one of the things that we've been successful in the polling business, and I belong to the American Association of Public Opinion Researchers. We also have the National Council on Public Polls, and they've been trying to hammer home at reporters for years, do not report polls unless they meet certain criteria. So media have gotten into their minds that they need to ask for the margin of error, the sample size, the dates of interviewing. So they got all that information in there, and they say, okay, then that must be an accurate poll if they can give me that information. But I say to them, before you reported this, did you actually read the questions that they asked? Yeah. Because that's where the bias comes in, not because they're weighting up Democrats or Republicans or any of that stuff. The bias almost always comes in the way they ask the questions. And you have to be able to judge that. And I think a lot of the media said, that's too hard for me. I'm just going to report this because this is interesting
So they
news.
just report the headline or make up a headline.
Yeah,
I bet you get frustrated with
now, some of them are good because they know
that
that it's coming from a partisan organization, so they won't report it. Some do, most don't. But sometimes you've got nonpartisan problems, nonpartisan organizations issuing this stuff, not because they're trying to be partisan, but because sometimes I think they're just trying to get a headline. You know, I mean, look, one of the things that we do for Monmouth is we market the university. The poll gets out there, people hear about the poll, they hear about Monmouth University. And we understand that's part of our job. But we had back in the 2008 Senate election here in New Jersey, we had an 84-year-old incumbent running. Right. And people asked me, is age going to be an issue? I said, I'm not sure age is going to be an issue. And we issued polls that consistently said anywhere from 30, I think it went up to 40% of voters, but usually it was around 30% of voters said that Senator Lautenberg's age was an issue to them, that they thought he was too old. Now, another pollster, Quinnipiac, found consistently a majority of 53, 54% said that Frank Lautenberg was too old. And so what was it? And that was always their headline. Sure. So you had these polls bouncing back and forth whenever they issued a poll, whenever I issued a poll, and people would run with it. And they'd say, oh, Quinnipiac says that this is an issue in this election. I said, it's not an issue in this election based on our polling. And so I did some experiments, and I started asking different questions. I said, do you think an 84-year-old person is too old? And a majority said yes. I said, do you think Frank Lautenberg is too old? And a majority said no. And then I said, so I asked a question, how old do you think Frank Lautenberg is? And the average guess was 75. Okay. Very few people, only about a quarter of voters actually knew that Frank Lautenberg was in his 80s. And that's why my poll was more, in fact, and this is where the media doesn't quite get the idea of perceptions and measuring perceptions, is, well, wasn't Quinnipiac more accurate because that is how old he is? I said, they're more accurate if you're asking the hypothetical of if 100% of voters knew how old Frank Lautenberg was back in 2008, would they consider age an issue? My poll was asking, based on what voters know today, is Frank Lautenberg's age an issue? And that, to me, is the better measurement of what the impact on the election would be, not what it would be if there was 100% knowledge, but what it is based on the actual knowledge that exists today.
Right. Knowledge, that's a fascinating concept to me, the knowledge level of people, which leads me to a question that's bothered me for a long time. I get a sense when I listen to polls, and by the way, I think that newscasts are too full of polls sometimes because without the context, and I know that's because the news cycle has gotten to just a few seconds on each story in many cases, but what happens when you call somebody and the interviewee, the person you're talking to, is totally ignorant of the issue? Do you still report? Do you still report that, or do you do an almost push-pull kind of thing where you inform them so they can give an answer?
Well, that's that's about good question writing, and it is, are you trying to measure opinion as it exists, or are you trying to measure opinion as it might exist if certain information was available to all people or known by all people? And there's a poll that was done, for example, one I can think of in New York City a few years back when they were pushing for bike lanes in New York City. And one poll came out and said 2/3 of New York City residents support bike lanes. Another poll came out and found it was only 1/3 that supported it. But both polls found that 1/3 opposed it. The difference between the two polls was that one poll said, or don't you know enough about this to have an opinion? And that poll got 1/3 who said opted out. The other 1/3 who supposedly supported it in the first poll were just simply saying, oh, it sounds like a good idea to me based on the fact that this is the first I ever heard of it. and they didn't have a true opinion on it. And that's what we have to be careful of. Sometimes we push people because we really want to push people to measure their opinion on a certain object, like the governor. Do you approve or disapprove? Hey, based on what you've heard of the governor, so what's your gut level reaction? So sometimes we want to push them, but there are some things we're asking about where I specifically put in, don't you know enough about this to have an opinion of it? And there's a number of times where we've seen some differences, significant differences in polls, specifically by putting that option in.
Okay. Now, if I want to play the skeptic for a moment, and I tend to think that oftentimes people are very ignorant of the complexities of a lot of policy issues.
Yes.
Don't they like to give an answer, especially yes or no, immediately, or they don't want to be embarrassed and indicate they don't know?
Not if you make it clear to them that another option is equally valid as an answer. Saying you don't know is equally as valid. And now we don't do it for every question. I have to make a conscious decision as a researcher. Is this a question where I want to push people on, or is this a question where I absolutely need to give them the option to say that they don't know? Because there are some cases where people will make them say yes or no, and some people say, absolutely, I refuse to say yes or no, I really don't know. And we will record that in our interview, and that they said they opted out, they said yes or no. I have to make that decision, and I think that's what distinguishes a good pollster from a bad one.
I would agree.
Understanding when those situations arises and when it's important to put in that other option, so that you know that you're not measuring, and it's not so much ignorance, it's that you're measuring an opinion that really doesn't exist for real. Yeah. That's the key. People might be ignorant of something and have a very strongly held opinion of it. And that's an important thing to measure.
But it's an opinion that does not exist for real.
But in some cases,
it's not based. Right. It's not based on a sound knowledge.
Right. Well, it's not. It's not. Some people might have. Yeah. And we do sometimes we ask, how much do you know about this? And so we look at people who know more or know less, and whether they have strong opinions or not. But a strong opinion. If you're a political leader, you need to know who has a strong opinion, whether it's an informed opinion or not. You need to know whether there's a strong opinion out there about something.
In other words, what are people paying attention to?
Right. And that's your cue to say, okay, I either need to do something different or I need to educate this public. Okay. That's what we do in our role.
So my last question, and we're running out of time, so I want a quick answer. How do you determine what a likely voter is? Yeah.
Because it's getting harder and harder because of the low turnout. It used to be that public pollsters would just call random phone numbers that served a particular geography, like a state, and then drill down and ask them a bunch of questions. Are you registered to vote at the place that you now live? How often do you go to vote? Do you know where your polling place is? And people could give any answer that they wanted to. In a large turnout election, the error that's built into those self-reports and wanting to seem like I'm a good citizen, that wasn't a lot of error. Now that we're getting such low turnout elections, that error is really driving some problems with polling.
And that's why we get some inaccurate
And so
ones.
I do it differently. I use actually a list-based sample, which is I get the list of everybody who votes in an election. And guess what? It's extremely consistent. People who vote in non-presidential election years, from election to election, are the same exact people by age, by race, by gender. You can identify them. So I say right away, if I look at a list of registered voters, I immediately throw out people who've only voted in a presidential election if I'm doing a midterm election.
Great information. It helps us understand a little bit more about these very powerful things. It seems to be powerful anyway, the polls. Patrick Murray, director of the Monmouth University Polling Center, thank you very much for your
Hey, it's my pleasure, Don.
Right.